There have been lifeboats in Salcombe for 150 years, and since the launch of our first boat in 1869, we've had 11 lifeboats based here in Salcombe. You can see the 11th, the Baltic Exchange, over my left shoulder. Since our first launch, we've launched on service more than 1,500 times and saved countless lives. And you can read the full history of the Salcombe and Hope Cove lifeboats in our recently published station history book written by Roger Barrett. This film gives a short account of those 150 years and covers some of the rescues. What it does do, though, is bring through the commitment, selflessness and bravery of the people who've served the lifeboat since 1869. I hope you enjoy the film.
A right and lofty ship from o'er Salcombe came.
Blow high, blow low, and so say we.
And her captain was a-searching for a pirate enemy.
Cruising off along the coast of the high Barbary.
In the early 1800s, Salcombe was little more than an obscure fishing port with a rather dubious reputation for smuggling. But by 1835, the town had become famous for its beautiful clipper-like fruit schooners. These were built in large numbers in the shipyards of Salcombe and Kingsbridge, and they were the ocean racing yachts of the day, racing back with cargoes of highly perishable fruit from the Azores, the Mediterranean and the Bahamas.
It was the disaster involving the sailing ship the Tea Clipper Gossamer near Praw Point in December of 1868 that led to the establishment of a lifeboat station in Salcombe. Aptly named the Rescue, the first lifeboat arrived in 1869.
The Lifeboat was built in London at a cost of £381, which included the carriage. She was very strongly built with double diagonal mahogany planking, and she was a self-righter. After being transported by train from London to Totnes, she was drawn on her own carriage by a team of horses to Kingsbridge, where she was greeted by huge crowds. Then she was launched in the estuary and, with coxswain William Quick at the helm, rowed and sailed down to Salcombe, where it was also greeted by huge crowds. The following year, the lifeboat house to house the Rescue was completed at South Sands, and this was paid for, as was the lifeboat, by Richard Durant of Sharpen.
5 years later, another shipwreck in Bigbury Bay prompted the RNLI to set up a lifeboat station at Hope Cove. The lifeboat was named the Alexandra after the wife of the Prince of Wales and was funded by the Freemasons.
Like the Rescue, she was also brought by a team of horses from Totnes and launched into the estuary at Kingsbridge.
In those early days, the lifeboats were all rowing boats that required enormous effort from scores of volunteers just to get them in the water.
Took 10 hours to row out and back again. It took 10 hours to go to sea. It took 10 hours to row out and back again. It took 10 hours to rescue me.
Propelling a boat with a laden weight of 6¼ tons required a supreme effort from the crew, and each oar alone weighed 25 pounds. Oars were painted white on the port side and blue on the starboard, and the reason for that was that the rudder was ineffective at maximum rowing speed. So the coxswain would have called, pull on the whites and back on the blues, in order to turn to starboard to face into the waves. When she was lined up, the 12 oarsmen took their timing from the starboard stroke and perfectly together fired the boat into the maelstrom of the surf. They all knew that one bad stroke or one caught oar would turn the boat broadside into the waves and she could be lost.
The first effective service for the Hope Cove lifeboat was to a wrecked T-clipper between Bolt Head and Bolt Tail.
The 920-ton Halloween ran aground at Sawmill Cove in thick fog at 7:45 in the evening. The crew fired flares and burned their clothing and bedding to alert the Coast Guard, but to no avail, and with huge seas breaking over the ship, they had to endure a bitterly cold night clinging to the rigging until the following morning when the Hope Cove lifeboat arrived and took all 19 of them off.
Although the rescue saw little service at Salcombe, by 1887 it was time for it to be replaced, again by another self-righter named the Lesty.
On the 27th of October 1916, the Salcombe lifeboat went to the aid of a wrecked schooner, only to find that all the men on board had already been rescued.
The lifeboat had launched at 6:50 a.m, just 1 hour after the distress call had been received in Salcombe. But just 2 minutes before, the whole crew of the Western Lass had actually been rescued by the Coast Guard.
In Salcombe, the Coast Guard at the watch house sent a message to the coxswain to summon the lifeboat crew. One of them was a young lad called Eddie Distin.
We were called out in the morning about 5 o'clock to a schooner ashore just above the Pearl Point, and very heavy gale of wind.
With a full crew and all her equipment on board, the William and Emma was hauled down the slipway and into the water by the launch team. This was despite the big waves that were looping round from the bar and actually hitting the small beach. Her water ballast tanks were full and each man wore his life jacket. News of the launch spread quickly through the town, and soon people were gathered along the path between South Sands, Eelstone and Bolt Head, and they watched the lifeboat battle its way over the bar and out towards the relative safety of the waters of the range beyond. We're going to retrace the course on that fateful morning on the 27th of October in 1916. Today on this modern all-weather lifeboat, it's only going to take us about 7 minutes to get to Langaston Point, where the Western Lass ran aground. For the lifeboat crew then, it would have taken about an hour even to row to Prawl Point, and that's with the aid of sails and the wind at their back. This is Prawl Point behind us there, you can see it on the chart. And in a storm is a treacherous and exposed place, and volunteers still keep watch at Prawl Point even today. And the Coast Guard, having rescued the crew of the Western Lass, would have actually seen the lifeboat coming round the corner out of Salcombe and heading towards the point.
We got to the wreck all right, but we couldn't get into the wreck because there was so much sea on the shore that we couldn't get near the vessel at all. So we laid about there for a while, and then we decided that we couldn't see no life aboard, so we decided to come home.
To return home, the crew had to sail straight into the teeth of the gale, which meant they had to tack to get round the point here.
And of course, on the way home, we met this disaster. We had been sailing, you see, we had all the canvas on. Well, then we decided to take our canvas down, because we were going to attempt to come in over the bar and rowing instead of sailing it. And while we were doing that, this big sea caught us.
A mountainous wave reared up behind them. It lifted up the stern and pitch-poled the whole lifeboat, stern over bow. The crew, all wrapped in stout oilskins and wearing life belts, were thrown into the boiling surf. Most of them managed to get back to the upturned hull and grip onto hand battens and lifelines. But as they did so, more waves hit them and they were washed off the hull. And this happened again and again.
All 15 got back on the bottom, but we couldn't stay there. The sea washed us off, you see. Washed us completely right away from it.
And there were just 2 survivors. Eddie Distin and Bill Johnson miraculously managed to make it ashore and were picked up at this point here that's known locally as Jones's Wall.
And we were washed up, well, almost like us two together, washed up side by side. We were washed up on a rock, a big rock, clear of the mainland. Well, and we had to get from this rock into the mainland. We were the only 2 that survived.
Some of the crew were washed up near the bar, others as far away as Kingsbridge. But the bodies of James Cove and William Lamble were never found.
Although the town had been dealt a shattering blow, life had to go on. The country was still locked in a brutal war. The Germans were stepping up their U-boat campaign against British and Allied merchant ships in Channel waters. There was an urgent need for a replacement lifeboat and a coxswain to take charge.
Well, they came to me. Well, I said, no. And I said, I don't think I really can. Then they kept on with me, really. At last I said, righto then. I said, I'll take it. And then I took charge. Well, I had to go round and round, pick up some young blood, some old. It was rather a rough crew, I tell you.
In early 1926, the Hope Cove lifeboat carried out one of its toughest services to the 3,000-ton ship Liberta of Genoa, just off of Bolt Head.
There was a dense fog and a heavy sea was running. Both the Hope Cove and Torbay lifeboats were summoned. The Alexandra was launched. Bill Hurrell, the youngest member of the crew at 18, later recalled that the tide was right out, so we had to push the lifeboat from the boathouse and through the sand. We were all soaking wet before we even got in the boat. After rounding Bolt Tail, they ran into a strong icy wind and heavy seas, and unable to set sail, had to row nearly the entire 6 miles to Bolt Head. It took them 4 hours, and it wasn't until 4 in the morning that they reached the scene of the wreck. Rough seas were breaking over the Liberta, which was jammed amidships on a large rock and plunging up and down like a giant seesaw. Finding it impossible in the darkness to get close enough to communicate with the Liberta's crew, the Alexandra laid off and stood by until dawn, as did the Torbay motor lifeboat, the Alfred and Clara Heath, which arrived shortly after. Together with a breeches buoy of the Hope Cove Life-Saving Apparatus Company, 33 men and 1 dog were rescued. 4 days later, the Liberta broke in half and shortly afterwards sank beneath the waves. In 1936, the annual grain race from Australia to England, between the last of the great windjammers, was won by the Herzegovina Cecily, a magnificent 9,242-ton 4-masted steel bark. Affectionately known as the Duchess, she reached Falmouth in 86 days, a full week ahead of her nearest rival. The following day, en route to Ipswich, she stranded in thick fog off Sawmill Cove. With a hole in her bow, her foredecks were soon awash. The bark's distress flares and rockets were observed by the Coast Guard, and Salcombe lifeboat was summoned. Eddie Distin and his crew of the Alfred and Clara Heath had no idea what they were looking for after they rounded Bolt Head.
Well, we found the bark, Herzegovina Cecily, full sail, everything fog, very dense. At all accounts, she hit the Amstone first, and then she came off that and went ashore into Surramill Cove.
In spite of the big swell and a fresh southwesterly wind, Coxswain Diston managed to get alongside the ship to speak with the captain.
And then the skipper said to the crew, "You get aboard the lifeboat." 22 crew. Well, then we brought him back to Salcombe.
After the lifeboat had refuelled, it returned and stood by, but this time the sea was too rough to get alongside. In the meantime, the life-saving apparatus was brought up from Hope Cove. A line was shot from the cliff, and after being made fast to the mizzenmast, a temporary breeches buoy was rigged. The sad fate of the Duchess was headline news around the world, and thousands of people flocked to South Devon to see the wreck. On the 19th of June, she was towed to Stairhole Bay, which offered the prospect of greater shelter and security. On the 18th of July, a southeasterly gale broke the back of the Duchess, ending all hope of saving her. But the once proud ship proved very reluctant to die, and it wasn't until January 1939 that she finally disappeared beneath the waves.
At the beginning of 1936, the Alfred and Clara Heath had failed to get over the bar, and concerns were being raised as to its suitability for Salcombe, and the call went out for a more suitable boat.
The RNR decided that Salcombe needed a new boat. The old Alfred and Clara wasn't powerful enough to deal with the conditions that we had here. So when they came to design a new boat, because of the bar in the entrance of the harbour, it was sort of decided to make it shallower draft. They put the end boxes on each end so that if she did start to bury herself, there was extra buoyancy to keep her lifted up. Because she's shallower, she's a lot harder in the bilges, so the turn of the hull on outboard is much harder, and so she tends actually not to roll as much. She's quite well behaved compared with the other boats of her type. The Alfred and Clara was almost sort of a little next move on from the sailing and rowing boat, in that she was still a fairly open boat, just had the advantage of having a motor on board. The Salmon and Mary was the first proper motor lifeboat at Salcombe. There was some shelter for the crew, and far more manoeuvrability. She had twin screws, so it was quite a big leap, I think, yeah.
The Belgian ship, the Louis Sheed, was in trouble. She had already picked up survivors from a torpedoed cargo liner and was hoping to make a safe passage inshore, but it proved to be too close inshore.
It was a terrible night, skipper. I can assure you that. Southeast gale, dark, raining, blowing, and you couldn't use a light. You daren't use a light during the war. I got outside of her, and I couldn't do nothing there. So I decided to go on the inside of her, which I did after one or two attempts to get alongside of her. Had a lot of women and children aboard. So I said to the captain of the ship, I said, well, come on, as quick as you can, I said, and I took 40. That was as many as I, daren't take, I said. I was afraid of going to wash them overboard in the sea. Well, then I sent a message ashore with a lamp and asked them if they could get a boat off from Oak Cove. Well, anyway, when I got back there, sure enough, they'd got the boat off, one of the crabbing boats. I got there and I moored up, dropped my anchor for a while, and they took them ashore, landed them on the rocks. I decided to go back again, because she had 100 aboard. And when I got back, she'd have shifted her position. She was laying more head to sea, you see, which didn't give me any shelter. Anyway, I got alongside of her, and I got 22.
In recognition, Eddie Diston received a silver medal, and his 7 crew members were each awarded a bronze medal. As the war continued, the US Navy started to arrive in Salcombe in huge numbers, with nearly 2,000 naval personnel, easily outnumbering the depleted civilian personnel. The Salcombe Hotel was taken over as Naval HQ, and the town and waterside was full of activity, mostly associated with repair and maintenance of landing craft, which were being gathered in earnest for the now notorious practice at Slapton for the D-Day landings. In 1951, and with 29 years of service under his belt, it was time for coxswain Eddie Diston to retire, having received numerous awards, including a bronze and a silver medal. The post-war years were fairly quiet ones, but the Samuel and Marie Parkhouse continued in service under coxswain Gerald Shepherd. A new lifeboat came to Salcombe in 1962, and the coxswain was another distant, Herbert, affectionately known as Bubbles, and he in turn was followed briefly by Owen Bungay Taylor, the first of 3 Salcombe lifeboats to be funded by the Baltic Exchange in London. Instrumental in getting that funding was the legendary Honourable Secretary Bill Budgett, known locally as Mr. Lifeboat.
Graham Griffiths, who was the person who capsized and lost his life, his wife was a bud, I think it was Edgar, was his father-in-law. He was friendly with one of the chairmen of the Baltic Exchange. He got in touch with Father and introduced him, and from then on it sort of took off from there. Father went up to meet the chairman of the Baltic, and then they just became friendly. They just said, right, we're going to take on Salcombe Lifeboat as our charity.
Baltic Exchange is a membership organisation that's been in existence for over 175 years. Its origins were a coffee shop in the City of London where ship owners, charterers used to meet and discuss pricing and arranging transportation of goods. That marketplace grew and became the global centre for arranging the transportation of bulk commodities. The continued relationship between Salcombe and the Baltic remains very strong.
The Baltic Exchange, when she came here, knew she had a lovely boat, and you had an enclosed wheelhouse and everything where the Samuel Marie Parkers, you were outside, you know, in all weathers. She didn't have a lot of equipment in her when she was new, you know, it was a UHF set, MF set, echo sounder and things like that. You know, we had no navigation gear, no radar, no nothing. So you put the position on the chart and the course to steer and worked out the tides and everything. Once you got your speed that you were doing on that particular day, then you knew if you was going 18 mile off, it was going to take you approximately, if you're doing 9 knots, 2 hours. Well, I think you were brought up in a town where you got the lifeboat going in and out and the maroons going off. He used to carry the mortar box out, put the mortar in, strike 1 off, and I used to pass him the next one, strike 2 off. Really like a big firework with an extension lead on them so that they would sizzle up the lead and then boom, which was a great thing in those days because obviously everybody then knew morning, noon and night whether the lifeboat was going to launch, because in the middle of the night you could hear it in Salcombe. Well, we knew there was a vessel ashore. We went down the harbour, touched the bar going out over. There was a big ground sea, but there was very little wind really. We went round Boat Head and saw this massive lights on the rocks. Well, she was aground. She'd got washed up on the rocks. Well, the swell was going under her keel and then right up over the top of the wheelhouse. It was a hell of a sight, to be honest. It was a sad sight. And Bubbles Diston was a coxswain, so we deployed the anchored her up, and plenty of rope right alongside where the trawler was, where we were the other day. And the flood tide was coming up with a big heavy swell, which made the lifeboat was parallel with a cliff, so it's made life a lot easier. Eric Diston fired a rocket line right between the 2 masts. It's funny where you get your strength from, really, because we were rolling like anything, and pulled the first one across and got him on board. And then took a breeches buoy back to the trawler, second one, third one, fourth. And then the skipper come aboard. They were all going down below, with Brian Cater was down below in the after cabin, looking after them. And we got them all off in 20 minutes, believe it or not. And then when we finished the rescue, we obviously recovered the anchor and that and steamed back here. By then the tide had made in here, so we could drop the crew ashore, you know, and look after them. Well, I mean, it's something in your life you'll never forget, and I'm lucky I'm here telling you the story, really. Once we got up off the start, it was pretty horrendous, really. It was horrible. And the boat that was intro was a dive boat, believe it or not, a big rubber dive boat, and she was on the Skerries bank. and the skerries were breaking heavy, really heavy, and we went up over the top of the bank. It was rough, it was horrible, it was big seas, and they were, of course, like the bar really, breaking on the bank, on the sandbank. Brian Cater shouted at Griffith, there's a big one behind us. And Mike Hicks had just gone out the wheelhouse door, because everybody, there was only two on deck anyway, Roger and David Lambo. And Mike Hicks opened the door and went out, and this big sea come aboard us, smashed the back of the wheelhouse in, and washed him overboard. And of course we had a man overboard situation then, so we had to turn around in the weather we were in. Another big sea hit us, and she buried her bow nearly back to the wheelhouse. And as she buried herself in nearly into the wheelhouse, the weight of the water on her foredeck, she went to starboard where the anchor was, and she went right round. Luckily, we were upside down, and you sit, no joking, you see your life go before you. You know, you thought, what a way to end up.
And so tuning into the VHF could be dodgy sometimes. And we just heard them, and Father was chatting away, and suddenly it just went dead. And Father said, God, what's happened? And nothing. So you tried to ring the Coast Guard, and I think they were on the phone, so we couldn't get through to them. And then eventually they came through and said she's gone over.
You didn't know where you were, a boat you saw nearly every day of your life looking after her, and everything went. It was like 100 people been there with hoses, like fire hoses, and the water was white in the wheelhouse, and all of a sudden it went still and dead and black, and you just had no idea where you were at all.
When they came back, said they could not believe the sense of being underwater, thinking they weren't coming back up again.
We're worried about getting back to pick up Mike. We saw him in the water and he was all right. He was doing everything he was trained to do. He had his head towards the sea, just laid there, just moving his arms, and, you know, perfect situation to pick him up really. So we turned around and we went back, and the lifeboat dipped herself down to the starboard, and there he was. And 2 or 3 of us just pulled him on board the deck, which was a good relief really. And then we realised that nobody had been badly injured. There was bruising and things, because David Lambo was up the top of the exhaust. And if he'd have missed that, it hit him across the chest, and if he'd have missed that, he'd been probably around the props. If she had capsized before 1972, it would have been a different ball game. There would have been a lot of crew lost. If we hadn't had the airbag, she wouldn't have come up.
And I fell in, I suppose I must have gone down about 5-6 feet in the water. And when I surfaced, I saw the lifeboat just sort of righting itself then. And my only thoughts were, you know, stop messing around, lads, come back and save me.
How long was the boat upside down?
Seemed a bloody lifetime to me. But it couldn't have been very long, you know, about a matter of seconds, I should think.
Was there any panic on board?
Too bloody right there was. Yeah, I was looking for the door. Well, I don't know. I should think there was, yeah. I was in a hell of a state, I'll tell you. I thought, God, how am I going to go so young as this?
2 years after these pictures were taken, Coxswain Griffiths was drowned while working on his own fishing boat.
That, in a way, is terribly sad when you think he survived the capsize and yet died at sea. And found, obviously, in a very, very sad situation, really. Because he was a lovely man. And in fact, he had to go to his wife, April, and he went up and April opened the door and she said, "Don't tell me. Don't tell me."
Brian Cater took over as coxswain and stayed in charge until the arrival of the new lifeboat, the Baltic Exchange II, in 1988. The new Tyne-class lifeboat was powered by 2 425 horsepower engines, giving her a top speed of 18 knots. Frank Smith was now coxswain, and over a 20-year period in charge, would be involved in many hair-raising rescues. Some of them well documented in 1993, when the Salcombe lifeboat and her crew were followed throughout the year by a TV film crew for a 6-part documentary series called Lifeboat.
The sea is breaking badly over the sandbar. just as it was when the Lifeboat went down in 1916. The yacht has tried to get in, but almost capsized and turned back out again.
I don't want that door open under any account. I'll check. All right? Yeah. Bit bloody shallow here now, isn't it?
The gale has turned the harbour mouth into a seething stretch of water. They're in for a rough ride.
Hold tight, you guys. Hold tight. Just hang on, you lot, for a minute. Let me see her at times.
Frank's plan is to go out and meet the yacht and then guide her back across the sandbar.
We're in the search area now. Call her up, say he likes to follow us. Right, as quick as you can out, shut the door.
Frank radios the yacht instructions to follow closely behind him into the harbour mouth. Tense moments now as they approach the bar. Few know these unpredictable waters as well as Frank, but the yacht could be turned over at any time. Frank pours storm oil on the surface, hoping to take some of the violence out of the waves.
Got the bait ready? When you're ready, give us a word and I'll put the thumbs up.
They've reached the bar. This is it. All Frank and the crew can do now is watch as the yacht threads through the waves which have undone so many boats in the past. They've done it. They're through. They've crossed the bar.
Perhaps the most daring rescue in 1992 was that of the Janet C, a coaster in trouble near Start Point.
The wind was horrendous. There was no point in pretending. It was a good net of 9 gale blowing. It was horrendous, and the time was beautiful. She went along. We got up to Pro Point. Couldn't see her. You know, Christ, where is she? And just as we went round Pro, we saw her lights. I thought, bloody hell, she's nearly ashore. She was rolling heavy, and it was horrendous. It was blowing hard. And I went back to the whim. I said, well, let's take her in tow. And I think everybody thought I was mental. But nobody argued. Nobody, they was all happy with it. And we went back our windward side, which was our, and we could not get a rope on board her. It was impossible. So we then went round our other side, our leeward side, and so therefore the ship was rolling down on top of us, which we didn't want. That was the idea of getting the other side. Guys on the foredeck, or the forecastle of the ship, realised that we were having a problem, and they threw their even line down. So we made fast the tow. It was hard work because you couldn't, it was no good leaving the throttles flat out because you'd have parted everything away and you'd have been in trouble. The weather was horrendous and it got worse. And John came up and he said, I don't like to tell you this. This was after about an hour and a half of towing her. He said, we're still losing her ashore. So instead of easing her back so much, I tried to keep her going. And then we had a trawler come there, Aaron Johannes. He called us up. And he said, I'll see if I can get my wire on board. If you go away to the southeast a bit more, I'll see if I can help you. And Well, his seamanship was fantastic as well, and he got back in there, got his wire aboard, and started letting the wire out to tow her, and he parted the wire. And he'd done that twice, and he said, I'm not going to be able to help you, but I'll stay with you. You could look down to the west, and you could see the wind scores coming through. It was just feather white, and then it would go away, it would be blackish. And then you see that another score and the sea breaking. And we kept going, we kept tugging away at her, and eventually John kept going down below. We had to open the wheelhouse door to get any info on the navigation. So we picked our time, he went down below, and I banged the door when he could come out, so we didn't have any water. Amazingly enough, we only had 2 big seas of border laying broadside to the weather. She was fantastic that night, laying there the time. She had a lovely boat. And the flood tide had started coming up, so the sea had eased slightly, it had, because the tide wasn't against the wind, and things had, I wouldn't say they were calm by any means, but life had got better.
Frank Smith retired in 2001 and Marco Brimacombe took over, and in 2003 saw the introduction of Salcombe's first inshore lifeboat, the Atlantic 75 with Joan Bate. In 2008, the much-loved Tyne-class Baltic Exchange II was replaced by the state-of-the-art Tamar-class lifeboat, the Baltic Exchange III.
Tamar-class lifeboat, it's capable of 25 knots. It'll do 25 knots in most weathers, even in the poorest of weathers. Shut it down to about 22, it's a good boat. This boat, crew comfort and safety, is just on a different level, totally different level. I don't think any one of our crew, once this arrived, would want to go back on a Tyne-class lifeboat. Nothing wrong with a Tyne-class lifeboat, but this one's in a different league.
With twin engines both developing 1,000 horsepower and a top speed of 25 knots, the lifeboat has an endurance of 10 hours at full speed and a range of 250 miles. The inshore lifeboat is a RIB, a rigid inflatable boat, and this is it. She's an Atlantic 75, the Joan Bate, and she's powered by twin outboard motors, 75 horsepower Yamahas, and they give her a top speed of 32 knots. It was one such occasion that showed the skill and the bravery of the inshore lifeboat crew as they battled to save the life of a bodyboarder caught in the surf at Sawmill Cove.
I could see the people on the shore, all standing there watching and realising I was in trouble. The waves were quite big and the rocks were pretty dangerous. There's some little rocks that stick out into the cove there. And there was one point where I was swept towards them, and I thought, this is going to be bad.
Well, we were tasked to go and pick up a bodyboarder in Sawmill Cove, an area we know well. The coxswain of the day thought that he'd been in the water for some time, there may be a medical problem, so he asked me to go. And the way out of the estuary, in fact, it was quite quiet, but when we turned round the corner to head west, out beyond the bar, it got really quite rough.
So once we come round Bolt Head, it was fairly lively, some fairly large breaking waves. Esther and myself were off our seats as such. Esther was at the stern of the ILB, looking towards the casualty, and I was sort of half on, half off, looking forward, telling Sam if there's any breaking waves coming.
It took us a while to realise that the leash of his bodyboard was wrapped around his arm, and it was meaning that he couldn't really swim. He was attached to his board and having difficulty keeping his head above the water.
At the time, we sort of shut one off and then to go in on one engine, so we had a spare to get out if we found the bottom or a rock or something like that. Generally use the engine furthest away from the casualty, so it keeps them a bit safer, especially in the sort of conditions that we were in. But we tried it with one to start with, and as it happened that didn't quite work out, so we used two. And with all the sort of problems with him getting tangled up, we just had to get close, grab him and pull him in. And It was a bit more brutal than normal, but that's what it took to get him out of the water.
And I thought it was all over. I stood there just watching the boat coming back out, and I suddenly heard them both go, "Oh my God!" And I looked up, and the lifeboat was like this. And my heart just went, I just thought, oh no, they're all going to be in the water. But I'm just amazed that people do this on a voluntary basis. I just think the skill and the professionalism that they showed was just incredible. There's no doubt Pete wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. So they made an incredible difference in our lives. Something we'll always be grateful for.
They did a fantastic job. I didn't really understand how good a job they did until I saw it on YouTube the following morning.
It was a mayday call to a fishing boat in trouble closer to home that was featured in the TV series Saving Lives at Sea.
The initial comms were man overboard and that he's been caught under the water. You hear Mayday, a man overboard, it sort of pricks your ears up and you're thinking, all this stuff we've trained for, this is where it counts now.
Any delay on a Mayday call can mean the difference between life and death. In charge, second coxswain Cameron has a decision to make. Wait for crew member Kirsten, a junior doctor, or launch the lifeboat.
You're sort of like drastically working out, have I got enough crew to go to sea, can I go now, or am I going to wait for the doctor? You know that you're going to need a doctor, but then if you wait longer, you get there and it's too late. The rest of the guys are on the boat looking at you and you're thinking, oh, do I, don't I?
Cameron gambles and decides to wait for the doctor.
When I got to the station, first thing I saw was Cam, who was like looking down at the street, and normally he like say hello to me or something friendly to start with, and he just went, "Get your gear, there's an unconscious fisherman," and I think that's all we knew at that time.
With Kirsten now on board, the crew pushed the Tamar-class lifeboat to its top speed of 25 knots in a race to reach the fishing boat.
Fishing is a very dangerous occupation, so they're used to taking risks. They're very good at looking after themselves, and I think often that's why when something goes wrong, it's gone wrong in a big way.
You're making comms to the Coast Guard, they've given you an update, you know, he's now on deck. They've got him breathing, but he stopped breathing again.
The fisherman has been pulled back on board unconscious. His crewmates are trying to resuscitate him.
Worst case is you arrive and he's not breathing and you can't get him to breathe. We do our best for that not to happen, but you can't control that. It's, you know, time is is always against you when someone's been in the water.
"25 minutes after the call came in, the crew spot the fishing boat. Kirsten and fellow volunteer James get aboard to make an immediate assessment of the casualty's condition.
As I got close to him and saw him properly, he was lying on his side and he just looked really sick. He looked grey, he looked washed out.
He was in and out of consciousness. You didn't get a huge amount out of him. He was bringing up seawater. You know when someone's not well, and he wasn't.
Although he's conscious, the fisherman's been underwater, deprived of oxygen for several minutes. He's also suffering serious injuries from being dragged across the deck by the fishing gear that pulled him under.
He was making a lot of effort to breathe. His heart rate was super high. We got some oxygen on him pretty much straight away. He needed equipment that we couldn't give on a lifeboat. Cam had said to me before, like, if you can, let's just walk him over and take him, you know, back into Salcombe. And I remember telling Coops, you need to tell him he's big sick and he needs to be immobilised and we need to get him out of here and quickly.
A Coast Guard helicopter has been scrambled, but it's coming from Newquay, over 50 miles away. The crew must now keep the casualty stable until it arrives.
Being underwater for that amount of time, drowning, not breathing, there are top-level sort of bad day things to happen. You're using every resource you possibly can.
Kirsten and James have been working to keep Silas stable for almost 10 minutes. Finally, the Coast Guard helicopter appears overhead.
When you see the helicopter arrive, it is a relief because you know that they're paramedics and they carry much more equipment than what we do, and they'll be in hospital in half the time as what it would be for us to steam in and get them in an ambulance. It could give them the best chance to survive if they get up in a helicopter.
Although they've stabilised him, the crew need to get Silas urgent medical attention.
He just looked awful by the time they were wanting to winch him up. The winchman looked at him and he was like, we need to get out of here, we need to get out of here quick.
The plan at the time was that the helo was going to drop down their stretcher, we'd transfer him and he'd go up. Sadly, he took a bit of a turn for the worse, and both Kirsten and Reggie, the winchman, life over limb, and it was made clear that an immediate winch was necessary.
Silas has flown 30 miles to Plymouth to be treated for serious neck injuries and the effects of oxygen starvation.
You're on tenterhooks because you know you've done the best you can do, but the level of his injuries were just so severe, he needed to get to a hospital.
All Cameron can do now is wait to find out if his gamble to hold the lifeboat for Kirsten has paid off.
The coxswain had made the right decision, and local fisherman Silas made a full recovery. As part of regular fundraising activities, the Salcombe Lifeboat holds open days. Many of the crew are on hand to explain the workings of a modern lifeboat. Running a modern lifeboat service not only requires the service of a full-time coxswain and mechanic, in addition to the scores of volunteers, but someone to manage the whole operation. This falls to the lifeboat operations manager.
If the casualty is out at sea, he might put out a mayday, it might be a pan-pan, it might be a medical emergency. It might be somebody on shore who notices something doesn't look quite right. From the sea aspect, the casualty will contact the Coast Guard by VHF normally. Sometimes it might be via a mobile phone if they don't have a VHF radio on board. The Coast Guard will then page the lifeboats.
We're requesting the launch of both lifeboats.
At that page, the crew start to assemble and make their way to the lifeboat station. The Duty Launching Authority will pick up the phone, telephone the Coast Guard, establish the nature of the situation, and then make his decision, and then authorise the launch of either the all-weather lifeboat, the inshore lifeboat, or sometimes both lifeboats.
Although the Hope Cove lifeboat station was closed in 1930, a campaign was launched to re-establish a lifeboat, and the Hope Cove lifeboat was formed, and in 2013 took delivery of a 6.4 metre rib craft to be known as Alexandra, following on the tradition of her predecessors more than 80 years ago. Just last year, the excellent inshore lifeboat, the Joan Bate, was replaced by an Atlantic 85, the Gladys Hilda Musto.
This boat's that bit bigger, so with the more length, we've got more weight, we have much more horsepower. It just makes the boat a little bit heavier, a little bit harder to handle in the sort of really rougher stuff. The 75, you could skip the little thing across rather large waves. With this one, you tend to helm it a little bit more like the ALBs, where you put the waves on the quarter and sort of bludgeon your way through a bit. The difference from the 75, the 85 is a faster boat. When the conditions are right, she can perform at 35 knots. And then nighttime, she's got advanced nighttime capabilities now with the radar and the direction finder.
Both boats had launched on exercise. They were doing some blind navigation to get out of the harbour, and then some first aid casualty care work on a yacht. Blind navigation is in the event of it being thick fog within the harbour, we've got to put to sea and get out to sea safely and as carefully as possible, and in a navigationally safe way.
Screens on all the forward windows, crew can't see where they're going, so the boat's navigated out by radar and nav, and then direction finding to the yacht, found the yacht, and then on the yacht we'd already placed our dummy.
We were using a resuscitation dummy, which we call Dead Fred, and he was in the cockpit and he needed some casualty care to try and bring him back to life. Whilst they were in the middle of their exercise, that they got the immediate tasking request from Falmouth Coast Guard. Fishing vessel on fire 6 nautical miles southwest of Salcombe Bar.
We're the ILB, not far away, so we tasked the ILB as well. We very rapidly recovered our wide boat.
Don't worry too much about the bag. Get yourself in. Good. Yeah.
I'll take all this kit. I'll take all this kit back to me.
Okay, clear. Untied. Clear, clear.
Taskings were quick, as we were already clear of the harbour and at sea. It took about 15 minutes, 15-20 minutes to get to the casualty, but it was quite apparent what direction we were going in when we were approximately 5-6 miles off, when you could see the plume of smoke coming up from the fishing vessel.
As you can see, a lot has changed in the last 150 years. The crews today, even though they go to sea in much more modern boats, do so with the same sense of bravery, selflessness, commitment and determination as their forebears did 150 years ago. The other thing I'd say is that there's a big team of people who support the lifeboat service here in Salcombe. The crews, shore crew, officers of the boat, fundraisers, supporters and all of their families. And that's been going on for a very long time here in Salcombe.